Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the live stream this morning. Thank you for watching, whether you are watching live or watching the recording later. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you watching this. I'm hoping that you find these valuable. I mean, we do cover material in here, and you do get to see things that you might have some otherwise, issues with otherwise in the material. So, these are useful, and I hope you're finding them that way. But we're starting Module 2 this week, and Module 2 has a look at CSS. And so that's what we're going to be working with today. But before we get into that, just a couple of quick announcements. I am in the process. I believe I'm pretty close, if I'm not already done. I need to go back and have a look. Of grading your Module 1 material, grading your Module 1 assignments. You can check those grades in the gradebook portion of the course. Also, make sure to read the comments. Especially if you didn't receive what you might have thought you should have received, make sure to check those comments to get my feedback on these assignments. But just as a reminder, I try to have everything graded within 7 days past the due date. So with this due this past Sunday, I try to have them graded within a week from that. That way I don't get too far behind. Getting behind, whether it's on your end or on my end, it's not very beneficial. So we want to stay up to date so that we're all current and we're all working with what we need to be working with. So I try to get grades back to you in a reasonable amount of time. But today we are talking about CSS. And we're talking about CSS in terms of making pretty possible, right? Last week we looked at standard HTML. We talked about how HTML is essentially the blueprint for our website. It kind of forms our foundation. It gives us our structure. But HTML on its own, as you saw with your labs this past week, the HTML on its own is pretty ugly, right? Like we have plain black text on a white background, Times New Roman font. Not really anything that's winning any big design awards. You can make a website that looks just the same in almost anything. But where we start to getting really good with web design and making websites is when we start to introduce CSS. And so, again, as we progress, like these first two modules are just little introductions to different concepts. And then as we progress, we build upon our knowledge more and more and more and more. And so this week we're introducing CSS. We're going to talk about what CSS is, how we implement it in a document, and how we work with CSS. To kind of build upon that framework and, put a coat of paint on it, do a little decoration with it, make it so it's not so ugly. But when we're talking about CSS, what we're really talking about is a set of rules. And so when we're thinking about CSS, we can think about them as rules. I'll even call them CSS rules as we start to talk about the different parts of CSS. So when we're dealing with CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And the idea of the cascade becomes important as we talk about, what style gets applied when. As you go through a cascading style sheet, it starts at the top and works its way to the bottom, meaning that the styles at the top get applied first, and then it progresses through the list of all the different styles, applying them to your HTML elements. And if you have styles in the later part of the document that override any of the previous styles that were in your document, it is those styles that are at the end of the document that are going to take precedence and be shown on your web page. Although there are some ways around that we'll talk about. There's this concept within CSS that we call specificity. And when we're applying specificity and we're applying CSS at different levels, these things allow us to have different layers of precedence between one element or another. But CSS, again, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and Cascading Style Sheets are rules. And each rule consists of two parts: a selector and a declaration. So at the bare minimum, to have CSS, what we're looking for in a CSS rule is a selector and a declaration. And I have a sample CSS rule here for you on the next slide. So this is a sample CSS rule. H2, and then in our curly brackets or our curly braces, color, colon, red, semicolon. So this is our general syntax that we're going to be writing CSS in. And so this is our most basic type of CSS rule, because we have, one property that we're changing on this H2 element selector, which the H2 is what we call our selector. So this is our selector in this case. We have three different types of selectors that we'll talk about a little bit later on in more depth. We have element selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. And, you can get a little more complicated in all that, because there are like pseudo selectors and properties, attribute selectors, and things of this nature. But since we're just getting started, two hands while we're learning, just like playing catch, we want to just focus on our primary selectors, which are going to be element, class, and ID selectors. So in this case, we have our H2 here. Our H2 here is our selector. And it is an element selector because it is the tag name of an HTML element. So if I'm in a document, and in my CSS I write this H2 selector, what's going to happen is my browser is going to go through, as it's interpreting this code, it's going to find every instance of where there's an H2, and it's going to apply these properties to those H2 elements. And you had a little bit of practice with creating those H1, H2, H3, so on and so forth, these different heading level elements last week in your lab. So you've seen this H2 before in the wild. Now conversely, here we have a declaration. And the declaration is the property that we're actually changing on our element here. So our color, colon, red, semicolon is the declaration here. It's what we're applying to this H2. And so what this does, if we were to implement this in our code, is it would go through, find every single one of our H2s, as we mentioned earlier, every single one of our heading level 2s in our document, and it would change the color of those heading level 2s to red. We'll talk in more depth about color a little later on. I could talk for days about color. It's a complicated concept, but it's something that we will talk about. But when we are adding properties and adding values to an element, we can add more than one. We have to have at least one, but we can add more than one. So we can have more than one declaration for our set of CSS rules for a specific element. And in each of these declarations, we have a property and a value. And we see that here. So we have our H1, in this example here, we have an H1 selector. And we have two declarations in this set of rules here. Color blue and font size 12 pixels. And so in this example here, we have them all on one line to save space. One of the things that I recommend to you is to separate these rules onto separate lines so that everything's nice and neat. And you can read things a lot easier, because when everything's on a single line like this, you kind of have to go through and pick out the different parts. So it's a lot easier to hit a line break after your semicolons here, after each declaration, to separate your declarations onto other lines. As long as they're in between those curly braces, You can separate them with line breaks. They'll be fine. But each of these declarations has a property and a value. And the property is the thing that we're impacting. So when we're thinking about property here, we can think about it as the thing that we are changing about this particular element. So in this case, for example, we have the property of color. So we're changing the color of this element. And then the value becomes what you are changing that property to. So in this instance, we have the property of color. So we're changing the color of our H1 element, and we're changing it to blue, because that's the value that we have listed here. On the converse, we have the font size here. So we have the font size property here. So we're saying not only are we changing the color, but we're also changing the font size. And we're changing that font size to be 12 pixels. So when we get into Module 3, the idea of pixel measurements will mean a whole lot more to you. But for the time being, understand that just pixels are the way we kind of size things digitally as we're getting started. When you get into more advanced courses a little later on, we'll talk about different ways to size things that are more dynamic, that are more responsive. But as we get started, we try to keep things simple. So we use the static sizing via pixels. So we have two declarations, each with a property, each with a value. So what does this all do? What does it all do anyway? So our selector points to the HTML element that you want to style. So just as we said before, you got an H1 selector, you got an H2 selector, paragraph selector, whatever you've got. That's going to have your browser go through as it's rendering the code and say, okay, I'm going to find every element that has this particular selector, and then I'm going to apply these declarations with their properties and their values to the elements that we see to change how they look on screen. Now, the important thing to remember here is our syntax. When we're talking about syntax, we're talking about it in terms of like if we were talking about English, we'd be talking about how you write sentences, right? Like you start the sentence with a capital letter, you put commas in places where you need commas, you end the sentence with some sort of period or exclamation point or question mark, depending on the situation. So we have a syntax here for CSS, where we start with our selector. Then after our selector, we have an opening curly brace or curly bracket. We have our declaration statement that we end with a semicolon. And so that semicolon at the end of your declaration statement is basically saying, okay, this sentence is over. This declaration is over. It's time to move on to the next one. And so we want to make sure that we're paying special attention to this syntax as we're writing it. Now, as we are preparing our document for HTML, one of the things that we might want to do is assign it a class or an ID. And we assign these inside of our existing HTML tags. So maybe I want more than one type of element to be green. I might have some H1s, I might have some H2s, I might have some paragraphs. I can create CSS rules for all of those element selectors, or I could create a CSS class called green and assign my declarations to that. But one of the big things here is just how we write these classes as attributes inside of our HTML tags. So we can see our example here, and we want to pay extra special attention to that. Because you'll notice that I'm here inside of my opening H1 element tag. So we see we have our less than symbol here, we have our greater than symbol here. We are inside of that tag. And we've added this class attribute of green. So we have a hypothetical class called green that we've written in our CSS. And as a result, we put it in our HTML tags as an attribute. And whatever rules that we apply to that class is then going to impact this element. So we're extending out beyond our element selectors here, and we are using these attributes to go into class and ID selectors. So let's talk a little bit more about selectors. So CSS selectors are used to style, or CSS selectors are used to find or select the HTML elements you want to style. And we have three different types of selectors, as we mentioned earlier. Element selectors, which are just our tag names. We've already seen examples of those. ID selectors, which are going to be defined by your HTML attributes. So when we're writing for an ID selector in CSS, it's going to look like, or in HTML, it's going to look like this. We're going to have our ID equals whatever inside of our opening selector. Now we have a little typo here. This should be CSS. CSS typo. It's represented in CSS by a pound, a pound sign, or what they call a hashtag. It's one of these. So when we are referencing this ID selector in our CSS, we're going to use that hashtag before the name of the ID, so that our computer, as it's rendering this, knows that this is in fact an ID, and it'll be looking for these ID selectors. Now, an ID selector can only be used once in your HTML. Only one element can have a unique ID selector. So that's something important to consider, is that only one element can be given an ID selector that's unique, right? Like I can have as many ID selectors in my HTML as I want to have, but all of the names of each of those ID selectors have to be unique and have to be referenced uniquely in the CSS. Because a particular unique ID selector can only be used one time. Now, if you want something that you can apply to different things, that's where you use a class. And we have a class that's defined in HTML by the attribute as well. So we can see here we have the h1 class equals green underscore heading. And in CSS, we represent it with a period. So as we're writing our CSS, before our ID or our class name, we'll put a period. And as our browser is rendering that, it sees that period, it's going to know this is a class. What follows this is a class name, so it's related to anything in our HTML that has the class attribute in it. And these can be used you can use a single class as many times as you'd like. So let's talk about adding CSS to our HTML, and then we'll parlay from these slides into a quick demonstration. But we can add CSS to our HTML in three different ways. There's actually a lot more, right? Like when we get into, like if you get into JavaScript, you know that you can do JavaScript, or you can do CSS in JavaScript, and you can do various other things where you're adding and injecting CSS through other means. But when we're using just pure CSS, there are three primary ways that we can include CSS in a document. There's a linked file, there's in document, and then there's inline. Now our linked file is going to be our most efficient method of including CSS in a document. Ideally, in a real-world situation, what you would want to do is have a linked file. Now, for our purposes, we can do in-document CSS. Since we're just getting started learning and we're not doing a ton of CSS in each of the documents that we'll be creating, we can do in-document CSS. But a linked file is going to be what you do in most cases in the real world. Now, why would you do this? Well, when you're working with a document, especially when you're working with a production document, you can have a ton of CSS and a ton of HTML in your document. Right? So what I want to do is I want to be able to isolate my CSS so that when I'm working on my CSS, I have just the CSS that I need to concern myself with. And then all the HTML is in another document. But again, with what we'll be doing with our small sites, with our little bit of CSS, not necessary, although if you wanted to do it in this coming lab that you're doing this week, you're welcome to do so. So how would we do this? Well, we would add a name to our file. So in the head section of our HTML document, we'd add a statement that looks something like this. Link rel equals style sheet, type equals text/CSS, and then href equals our style sheet. So let's start off by just doing this in an example. And then we'll move on to some other stuff, and we'll kind of use some CSS to do some different things as we go along. So let me head over to my advanced code editor here. We'll go full screen. So right now what I have here for us is simply an HTML file with an HTML skeleton. I did this earlier and just saved it to my drive here just to get it out of the way ahead of time. I followed the same procedures as we did last week in our demonstration. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new file, and I can create a new file in these advanced text editors just by clicking up here in this tab bar. Now this gives me an untitled no file extension file. So what I want to do first, so I can take advantage of the features of this, is I actually want to save this file. So I'm going to File, Save As, and this is a CSS file, so I'm going to select CSS from my Save As type. And then this is going to be whatever we want to call it. We'll call it style.css for the purposes of this demonstration. So now we have ourselves a separate CSS style sheet here with our CSS underscore demo.html file here. Now by default, this style sheet is not going to work. I have to link this style sheet inside of my HTML document, and that's what we were doing on that slide there, is that was the code to link our CSS file. So what I want to do, we'll zoom in so you can see this just a little bit better, is in the head tags here. Remember last week we talked about that our head tags are things that we might want our browser to render, but we don't necessarily want our users to see this information. So in between our head tags, this is where we put the link to our linked style sheet. So we'll start typing link rel equals style sheet. Type equals text/CSS. href equals. Now up until this point, every time you write this line, it's going to be exactly the same. The only thing that really changes is the name of your CSS style sheet that you're working with. And you want to make sure that the folder that CSS file is in, is the same folder that your CSS or that your HTML file is in. So we're going to say style.css. They're in the same folder. And then this link is a self-closing tag, so I don't have to have a closing tag to go with it. So now we have this style sheet that we just created related to this HTML file here. So I can go ahead and save this. Now, I have the demo file here, open in Chrome. If I refresh it, we can see that there's nothing here. One of the easiest things to get started with to practice our CSS is changing the background color. Right, so that's what we will do to kind of get ourselves started here, and we'll do it in our external style sheet. So I'm in my style.css file now, and I'm going to change the background color of the website. So when we are changing the background color of the entire website, what we want to do is we want to take and impact what would be the parent of every element that is shown on the screen. So what we talked about last week is that the body section is where we put all of our elements that gets shown to our user. So if we want to change the background of the website, we're going to have to point our CSS at the body of the website. So it's going to be the body element selector. We'll have our open and closing curly braces. And then we'll add our background color declaration. So that's the background dash color colon. And let's make it a light blue. Let's see, maybe like a light, let's go 0099FF. Can we make that a little lighter? Maybe let's add a little bit of red into it. Like that. To make this the background of our website. So one of the things that's useful about one of these advanced code editors, like I'm in Visual Studio Code here, whatever you've chosen to use. One of the cool things about Visual Studio Code is when I type a color in here, I have this little indicator here that shows me what my color is, and it even gives me a little color picker to where I can change it and edit it if I hover over that. One of the things that confuses people a lot of times is the difference between color and background color. So background color is for backgrounds and color is for text. So when I'm using just the word color impacts text color. Background dash color impacts the background of an element. So let me zoom out here. We'll make sure this is saved. And now we have our CSS demo website here. I need to refresh the page before we can see the changes. And so I'm going to click our refresh button here. And we can see that we have a light blue background to our website now, which is good. So that's what we want. Now, let's add a couple of elements into the body of our HTML. What I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to write some kind of container element. Then I'll put a heading and I'll put a paragraph. So I'm going to use the main container element from HTML5 that lets our browser and accessibility tools know that this is the main part of our website. I'm going to add an H1, and we'll just give it some kind of some kind of heading here, like my first website. And we'll have some kind of paragraph here. Let me put some dummy text into this. We'll go over to a different screen, grab some dummy text, just so we can have a little bit of dummy text to put on our site for our example here. So now we have 3 new elements that we've introduced into our site: our main container, our H1, and our paragraph. And if we save this, we can go to our site here and refresh it, and we can see that stuff there. Now, one of the things here that you might notice is that, well, it's a little bit hard to read. Right, so one of the things that I can do is I can change the background colors on specific elements. So for example, I have this main container here that's acting as the parent element to my H1 and my paragraph. So my H1 and my paragraph are inside of my main element. So since that is the parent of these two, if I want a consistent background color that goes across the two of them, I can apply a background color to main, and that will, since it's on top of the body, that will change the background color that's behind these two elements. So I'm going to add an ID selector here, an ID attribute, and I'm going to set that ID attribute to main underscore container. And we'll give our H1 a class of DK underscore blue, dark blue. So we'll have we'll change our header to be dark blue. Then we'll do some other stuff with what we have here. Right, so we have an ID selector and a class selector. And so let's reference these ID selectors and class selectors in our CSS now. So we have ID equals main underscore container. So if I want to, and let me make sure I've saved here before we go on. If I want to create a new rule for this main underscore container, what I'm going to do is these curly braces they contain all of the CSS rules for whatever element we've selected at the start. So when I want to make a new set of rules, I'm going to come below the bottom curly brace and start writing my new set of rules. Now this is for an ID called main container. So we are using our hashtag in our CSS, because when we see this hashtag in CSS, that means ID. So when our browser's rendering this stuff, it's going to see this hashtag. Then in the CSS demo here, it's going to go through and look for anything with the ID of main container, because we're going to hashtag main underscore container and add our curly braces. And in this case, we're going to make our background color white, so we can really have the background stand out. Now what I'm also going to do here is I'm going to add a little bit of something called padding. We'll talk more about what padding is in Module 3, but essentially what it is it gives us space, a little bit of space between the content of a box and the edge of that box. So we'll just put 12 pixels of padding here. We'll talk more about the specifics of that in Module 3. But now if we go to our website here and refresh, we can see that our main section here has a white background behind it. Which is pretty cool. So now this part with our text here is a lot more readable. So let's go back here. Let's make some different, let's make some more rules. So let's refer to our class selector now, which is dark DK underscore blue. And notice that since we are doing a class selector here, we have this period that's starting this class name here, just like we have this semicolon for this ID name. In our CSS, when it sees that period, it's going to say, oh, that period stands for class. Whenever I'm going through and finding stuff in the HTML, I'm looking for something with the class attribute of dark blue. And we'll just set this to have a color. Remember, color is for text. Background color is for the backgrounds of things. So this is going to be a color, and we're going to make it a dark blue. So it'll be something like 335588. That's a little bit darker. That's a little bit darker than our background blue, but still light enough to where you could see that it's a different color. And so we'll save this. And now we'll see how that impacts. So this is what our website looks like now. What we're paying attention to is our element that has the dark blue class on it, which is our H1 here. So when we refresh, we can see that that color changes. And we are starting to see some real difference here. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to show you how to write CSS rules that can apply to multiple things. So here in my CSS, what I want to do is I want to have different selectors that are separated by commas. So if I want to, say, change the font family of both my H1 and my paragraph, I can H1, comma, paragraph, and change my font dash family property to have the value of sans serif. So right now our site has a serif font. The serif font is the font that has the little jaggy pieces sticking out of it. The sans serif, the serif fonts like Times New Roman. Our sans serif fonts are the fonts that don't have those little serifs or jaggy pieces sticking out of them. So they're more like Arial or Helvetica or Verdana. They're much more readable on a digital screen. So we have this. We want to make sure that we're saved. And we'll come back over here and we'll refresh. And we'll see that we now have a sans serif font. And so we went from something that was incredibly basic, that was just black Times New Roman text on a white background, and we've actually started to make it look like a website. And we didn't have to do a whole lot to it, right? It's actually quite simple. So as we're looking at that, that's how we put our CSS in a linked style sheet. But we can also put this style in our document. So if we're putting it in our document, we're putting it still in the head of our document. But we're going to put it in between style tags, and we're going to do the exact same stuff. So we can see the example here. We have style tags, style type equals text slash CSS, and then we have our rules inside of that. So if we go to our website and we examine the same thing, I'm going to just copy this code out of here, copy all of that, and I'm going to remove this link to my style sheet in the in the file. And actually, it'd probably be better if we just commented this out. So let's write an HTML comment line to comment that section out. So now, since it's commented out, as our browser is going through and rendering things, it's going to ignore that. We'll save this. So now when we go back here and refresh, we see we're back to where we were at square one. Plain black text, plain white background. And we'll add this in now as in document CSS instead of linked CSS. So inside of my head here, remember that's where we put everything that we might want to change some stuff, but we don't necessarily want our user to see. I'm going to add my style type equals text /CSS. Text /CSS is in quotes. That's going to have an accompanying closing style tag, and I'm just going to take and paste the CSS that we wrote in our CSS file just in there because the changes to it aren't any different. So remember that the first way that we demonstrated it there is the ideal way. It's the way that you would want to do it in the professional industry. However, this second way here, putting it between these style tags just directly into the header for the majority of our purposes is going to be just fine for what you need to do. It'll limit you in the amount of files you have to submit, and you keep everything in one file, so it's a little bit easier to keep track of. But I can save this now, and we can check to see what's happened. So remember that when we commented that link out, it tells our browser to ignore it. So it's not looking for that style sheet anymore. But now we have these styles in our header. So now when I refresh, the styles are back because I put the styles here in the head of the document. Now the final way that we can add CSS to a document that we discuss is via inline style sheets. And these actually go inside of a particular element. And this is kind of a last resort. This is not something that we usually want to do, right? Ideally, since it's going to allow us to apply things to multiple items at a time, we want to do either linked or in-document CSS. When we're getting to this inline CSS, it is specifically for one specific HTML element that's in your body of your HTML. And so we can just add a style attribute into the opening tag of an HTML element, as you can kind of see here. And that's going to change the style of that element. So if I go back to my document here now, let's focus on this paragraph. And let's change the color of this paragraph here. So that's style equals, and in quotes, color, red. So we'll just make it bright red so it stands out and it looks different. So we'll save that here. Prior to refreshing here, we have black text. When we refresh, we have red text. Now it does matter, in the larger sense of things, which of these elements you use, because of something called specificity. So we have this idea of specificity, and it's going to be based on different things. So if there are two or more conflicting CSS rules that point to the same element, the browser uses some rules to determine which one is most specific and therefore wins out. So we can actually calculate specificity based on where the CSS is located in relation to the document and what type of selector is utilized in the document. So when we're calculating specificity, we're looking at something like this. Right, so the highest specificity is going to be that inline CSS, that last thing that we looked at there. It's going to override anything else that's done via CSS to the document. Because it's inside of the HTML element, it's one of the last things that's rendered, it's going to override everything. And then we go from ID selector to class selector to element selector in terms of highest specificity to lowest specificity. And we can actually assign these a number if we wanted to think of it that way. Like I can say like, well, this is 4, 3, 2, and 1. So if the CSS is applied to an ID selector, it's going to be more specific than if the CSS is applied to a class selector. So if there are conflicting rules, one in a class selector, one in an ID selector, the rules in that ID selector are always going to win out, regardless of where those elements fall in that cascade. So we have this little example here on the next screen. So we have an unordered list, and we'll talk more about ordered and unordered lists a little later on, because lists are a big deal. We have this unordered list with 3 items, and the list of its items all has class names. And we've created 2 different CSS selectors. Which one is more specific? So, regardless of where these rules are placed, our class has a higher level of specificity than our element selector. So this is going to be red. Now we said earlier that cascading style sheets applies the final style last. But it's with this specificity that we can override that cascade. So for example, let's look at that if we put it in the document here. Let's say, right now we've got this P style equals red. If I were to try to put a color on my P element here, color green, that's not going to make a difference, right? Because that inline style there has more specificity than anything in my in-document styling or in a linked style sheet. So if we make sure we save, we have saved, and come over here and refresh, still going to be red. Now if we removed this, now it's going to be green. So now it's green. But let's say for a moment that we add a ID selector in here. So let me zoom in for you. We'll add an ID selector. ID equals blue. And we'll add a class selector. Class equals red. So you can have that. You can do that in CSS. So we have our P tag that is our P element selector that's colored green. We'll take our dot red class and give it color red. And our hashtag blue ID selector and give it color blue. Now, based on our basic understanding of CSS, since we have these 3 elements that impact the same item, the idea of the cascade is that they are, it's going to take the last one and that's going to override it. So we should expect this color to be blue. So we'll save that. We'll come over here. We'll refresh this. And we see we have blue text here now. But where specificity comes in is if I cut this and put it up here. Now we've broken our standard cascade flow with our elements, or with our rules here. You might expect red to be the color that gets precedent because it's the last one in the list. However, if we go over here and refresh, it's still blue because this ID selector has the highest level of specificity. And the only way that I could override that ID selector would be to use something with a higher level specificity or inline CSS. So if I come back down here, add some inline CSS, style equals, let's make it a pink. So that is 2 times red than blue. So that's going to be color, hashtag FF 0088 will give us like a bright pink. We'll save that. So that's the only thing that's going to be more specific than our ID selector. So now when we refresh this site here, it's going to change from the blue to our bright pink. And we could probably make that a little more pink. Let's drop that blue value to, or let's raise that blue value to like AA. Just to make that a little more pink. There we go. And so that's how our specificity works. Now we're running up on an hour here, so I think I'm going to go ahead and stop our live stream here. That's a lot of information to cover in a day. Normally I like to cover more information about color, so I might put out a separate video toward the end of the week that is specifically about color. I could talk about color for a long time, so we won't get into that here in an effort to keep this live stream short. So we will stop this live stream here. If you have any questions, please let me know. But as always, thank you for watching. I'm going to hang out in the chat for just a minute, just in case anybody who's here watching has any questions. But if you're watching this later and you have any questions, please send me a message, send me an email. As always, thank you for watching and have a nice day.